How to train research assistants to clean data. You'll see that I have clickable links in the slides that you can go to. And if you're not sure about something I'm talking about, you might check in the terminology appendix or the additional details appendix. I put some stuff back there because I know depending on your field, you might refer to things in different ways. So if you need to know what I'm talking about, that might help you figure out what's going on. So you can click back there and see what's happening. Okay, so the motivation for this talk is this quote, which says good statistical analyses, and I add, and data cleaning, include judgments, and we have not taught our students how to make those judgments. So the outline of the talk, first, I'm just going to talk briefly about why data cleaning is important. You all are here. I already sold you the data cleaning message, so I won't spend too much time on that. Then we'll talk about general principles associated with data cleaning, and then steps in data cleaning and the order of these steps with some caveats. So introduction. Data cleaning is the tedious stuff that takes a lot of time. It's addressing missing data, it's labeling variables and values, it's recoding variables, it's importing, dropping, and there are various statistics that go around about this is 80% of what a researcher does, this is 85%, this is 70%, but it takes a long time. It's a lot of what we do, and yet it's very little of what we offer in our courses. What we offer in our courses is the data analysis, which is just running your model and creating tables for your final deliverable. Or figures for your final deliverable. And even the process of creating effective tables and figures isn't often covered in traditional classes, though I know that Digital Commons has some great lectures on how to do this, but running your model is really what we're focusing on and interpreting that in our classes. So data cleaning gets a little bit left out. And that may have led to some myths about data cleaning, one being that it's straightforward. It is not, because there are a bunch of different decisions that researchers have to make during the data cleaning process, and there's no one size fits all method to data cleaning. So a data set that's clean for my research question might not be clean for your research question. So data cleaning decisions are very contextual depending on what you're interested in. And research has shown that researchers make different decisions about data cleaning. And so it's not the same. There's not one way to do it. And there's also this idea that data cleaning is somewhat atheoretical, right? That we can just assign somebody to do it and it doesn't matter. And that's not true also, and we know that. We need the decisions to be made in the theoretical context because decisions about data cleaning can affect our research findings. So why is data cleaning important? This is an example not intended to shame anyone, just one that shows you why it's important and why we all are capable of these kinds of mistakes. They claimed that a CEO's personality traits can affect the group dynamics of a top management team. And somebody else looked back at their data, and basically if you remove one outlier, only one of the original 17 interesting correlations still was there. That's a problem, but often people don't think to look at outliers, or especially if things are going in the direction which they predict, right? So if things don't go in the direction we predict, we're like, did we clean the data correctly? But if things are going the way that we expect, maybe we don't check it as carefully. So we don't want to have our work, to be retracted or to have a lot of questions about it. We want to try to avoid that when we can. So we're all error prone. I make a lot of mistakes. We all do, but most of us, I think, are trying to do a good job and trying to produce good research. But having some sort of a systematic approach to data cleaning can help us identify the holes in our data cleaning processes. Such an approach also enhances reproducibility and replicability, which is a cornerstone for scientific progress. I won't get into why, but if a finding occurs once, that's great, but that's not very strong evidence for something happening. It's if this continues to occur, and for something to continue to occur, we need to understand how it's being studied and try to repeat those processes. And a strategic approach to data cleaning can enhance that. We also, of course, want to accurately represent our data. The decisions made during data cleaning, such as if we want to dichotomize or binarize variables, decisions about missing data, scaling methods, transformations, they can all greatly affect our interpretations. And finally, we want to make sure we're meeting the model's assumptions. So whatever model we decide to use, we need to meet the assumptions that underlie kind of the statistics and the math that made these models capable of predicting things. So for example, with linear regression, normality of residuals, homogeneity of variance, we've all heard these. If you've done a linear regression, you're familiar with these, but we're not expected in papers to report our tests of these. So reviewers aren't looking at them. And so it doesn't become something that is normative practice necessarily, unless if we are used to doing it or we're checking for this consistently. So it's not something that anyone externally is asking us to do very often. And a failure to meet model assumptions can change interpretations of findings, leading to both type 1 and type 2 error, meaning we think we found something when we didn't, or we don't think we found something when we did. Both of these kinds of errors can really happen. And yeah, when teaching stats, it's super easy to overlook the checking assumptions step, because it's like, we got to get into the meat of it. And also, I wasn't taught about checking assumptions. They're like, yeah, assumptions are important. Make sure you check them. Anyways, let's get into, because there's some bigger, I don't know, fish to fry, that's the word. But, you know, without these foundational things, we can't be confident in our findings. Okay, so again, we all are here because we know it's important. So what are some best practices in data cleaning? Planning. Planning is a best practice. Why do we plan? It ensures you're being strategic and thoughtful about your data cleaning. You're not just kind of going with the flow. It also makes you more efficient, and it keeps you honest. And by keeping you honest, what I mean is there's this idea of the garden of forking paths, which is that we can take all of these different paths and each one might lead us to a slightly different p-value. And if we're using null hypothesis statistical testing, we want it to be p is less than 0.05, but maybe many of the paths wouldn't have led to that, but this one path would. And maybe people are more likely to think, oh yeah, well then that's the path that's accurately specifying everything, because of course it is, right? So I did this in a paper I was working on recently. I pre-registered it, which is something we'll talk about later. And then I went back and I had a control variable in there that I hadn't pre-registered, but I was like, of course it needs to be in there. And it made it so that it bumped it down to 0.001, whereas without it, it was different. So I just report both of those now. And I say why this control variable is interesting, but that I didn't hypothesize it and more research is needed about the role of this control variable. Really easy to say, really easy to do. But if we're not forcing ourselves to reckon with what we originally thought, we might not be motivated to do that. So planning kind of keeps us honest, makes us think about what our actual decisions are. And there are a lot of psychologists that explain why our brains do this to us and why, even though we try to be honest and good researchers, we have this, you know, these other motivations as well. Okay, so what do we plan? I recommend planning naming conventions for files and variables. So for example, by naming conventions for files, this is something I talked about a couple of weeks ago, but how do you want people to name their code files so that you know what they're doing in that file? How do you want people to name the files that you have for your papers? What are you doing here? Just come up with some sort of a strategy for the file naming. And we can even share those slides if folks are interested in it. That gives some more details about how to name files, because I went into excruciating detail on that, which I thought was a blast, and I think folks enjoyed as well. Also, how do you want to name variables? So are you going to have a lot of binary variables indicating education, and some start with ed for education, whereas others don't? Well, we probably want all of the education variables to start with the same thing or to know what they're starting with. Similarly, if we have a lot of race variables, do we want them all to start with an R so that we know that's all race? Or do we want to just have different, you know, white, black, Asian, etc.? How do we want to do that so we all know what we're talking about? Variable names that are come up with on the fly tend to not be very good. So we want to think through at least some conventions about how we're going to name things to avoid a lot of confusion down the road. We also want to plan our folder and file structure, where we're putting things, and have a place for things for our RAs to know where we're looking for things and where they can look for things as well. We just want to be clear about where things are. We want to plan our final analyses, because those help us understand what kinds of data cleaning we need to do. So if my final analysis is going to be a linear regression, most likely, then I need to know that these are some assumptions that I need to check. I need to know that I need to create this one scale variable. So thinking through the final product and then kind of planning backwards, which sounds very obvious, but often is kind of like, let's just take a look at the data, see what's happening. Just think about what you want your final analysis to be and then go backwards from that. What the data cleaning steps are that need to be done and in what order. And I'm going to talk about this all in part 2, so just hang tight there. And then how you will check that data cleaning is done correctly. How are you going to make sure that things are done correctly for yourself, for your students? How are you going to train them? So if you're looking at education and you created a binary variable for completed more than college or completed less than college, you should probably compare that with maybe your years of education variable and maybe some other sort of categorical variable just to make sure they're all aligning. And so plan those little checks, or at least let students know that they should plan to have checks in there, and that will help us all be comfortable that variables were created correctly and things are looking good. Okay, transparency is another best practice in data cleaning. And transparency is just the process of making research easy to reproduce. And it involves the sharing of information such as your data, your methods involving data cleaning, sensitivity analyses, planned and exploratory findings. So transparency is really the process of just spelling everything out and not having some sort of black box where the research goes to and then comes out in this pretty final form, but just making explicit all of these processes. And by making them explicit for yourself and your research assistants, you can make it explicit for other researchers who are interested in building on your work in the future. So some tools for transparency. One is pre-registration. And pre-registration is simply the process of stating your hypotheses, desired samples, exclusion criteria, study design, and analysis plans on a public repository before you embark on your study. What are you going to do before you do it? And I have a whole section on what pre-registration is, how to do it, what it's not, some misconceptions about it in the appendix of this. So I won't spend too much time on it right now, but pre-registration is something that if you haven't looked into, you might. I actually make my students who are doing dissertations pre-register them, or at least fill out the pre-registration form, because it helps me basically review their paper before they've written it. Otherwise, if they say, yeah, I'm going to clean the data and kind of run some analysis like this, it all sounds fine. Like that sounds reasonable. But once it's all spelled out and very clear, it makes it much easier to say, oh, okay, these were planned analyses, these were not, this is what you were thinking about. There are many benefits to pre-registration, but it is one tool for transparency. It also helps you plan. Another tool for transparency is publishing all of your data and script files. And we're really moving toward this in social science. And if you have an eye toward the fact that you're going to be publishing all of your data and script files, you're probably going to do a better job keeping track of things for yourself as well. So I was a research assistant on a project when I was getting my master's, and the person who was leading the project, the PI, died, and it was super tragic and unexpected. And to honor him, we wanted to publish his work. You know, I really liked the man, but I was cursing his name as we were trying to reproduce his work because we couldn't figure out what he did and what we were up to and everything. And it was really hard because we ended up publishing something, but it wasn't probably what he would have been able to publish. And so I often think about like, okay, how mad would my co-authors be with me, or how mad would people who were trying to do nice by me be if they tried to come back to this and figure out what was going on. And, you know, I think we dedicate a lot of our time and our lives to this. And so it's kind of nice if we can make it a little bit easier on ourselves and others to figure out what we did.
Bianca, I'm going to ask a newbie question here. Yeah. I think I know the answer, but I want to make sure other people do too. So when you say script files,
oh yes,
what do you mean by that?
Yes, so that
I think there's a threshold concept here that's really important.
No, I'm really glad you asked, and that is in the terminology appendix as well, because I knew I was going to skip over it. But a script file is any file that you have code in. So in Stata, that might be a .do file. In R, that might be a .r or a .r markdown file. So anything where you're doing anything with data in a software program. And the big thing that hasn't been said yet, but I'll say later, but I should probably say now, is I recommend you do all your data cleaning within a software program, not using Excel or doing anything manually. And the reason for that is you can keep track of every change you've made. Whereas if you start doing things manually, you might press a button here or there and not realize it or not keep track of what you did. And then when you try to recreate it, you can't, unless if you kept very, very, very specific notes every time you clicked a mouse, which none of us want to do.
Yeah.
So all of this, I think, should be in some sort of software program, SPSS, SAS, whatever the heck you use, choose your poison, but make sure that when you're doing it, you can keep track of everything you did. Thanks, Derek. I appreciate you asking that.
Yeah, sure. Well, and I think it's easy to get excited about the data that you have and that you get it cleaned up and ready to analyze, right? Because we want to move to the analysis step. But if you're going to get more data of the same kind, then you're going to have to clean it in the same way next month or next year. And so you want to be able to document and maybe automate some of that.
Yeah, and you want to leave that option open to yourself. So in my pre-registration, I said we would have 500 people in our study, and we had 400 who passed all of the checks. And if I didn't have everything data cleaned in a way that I could easily reproduce, I would have been like, well, 400 is good enough, because that would have been a hassle to have to redo all of that by hand. But I can just click a couple of buttons and get back to where I did and get those extra 100 participants, have that statistical power, feel more confident in my findings. And heck yeah, if you do that all, you're gonna save yourself some time down the road. So yes, I take that for granted often, but that is really important to say. So another thing is a data management appendix. And what this is, and this is something I just kind of like came up with that I've been trying to do, would love your guys' feedback on it, but it's an appendix in which you describe your data cleaning and management decisions for reviewers and or other scholars that are interested in building on your work. So I recently submitted a paper to Stigma and Health, which is a psych journal, and I included a data management appendix, and one reviewer actually read it and was kind of a jerk about it, but it was great because it improved the work, and otherwise I wouldn't have had a reviewer looking at it. And the whole time I was like, why did I publish this thing? Grumble, grumble, grumble. But it made the work so much better, and it was what I wanted, right? I wanted someone else's eyes on this before it went public. And so that's great. So you describe at what point you dropped participants, right? This many were dropped for missing this thing, this many were dropped for missing this thing, etc. You talk about how you might have created a variable and the kinds of statistics you looked at to make sure that the items that were, part of that scale variable all hung together. This is where you can describe all of that. It's needed because, as we know, at least in social sciences, data analysis decisions are reviewed in depth during the review process. People will say, oh, well, why didn't you have this control variable? Or why didn't you use this model? The data cleaning decisions can have just as large of an effect, but they're reported less frequently, and so they're not reviewed. And pre-registration is great because it allows you to report your plans, but not your actual processes, and it doesn't allow you to get into the nitty-gritty of that. So data management appendices, I think, are cool. I would love to know your guys' thoughts, and they've really helped with my own work as well. So something to think about. Just when you're doing them, the decisions pertaining to data cleaning and as they were made. I do a sloppy copy of this as I'm working on the actual paper where it's just ugly. It's not cute. It just has all of the information in it. And then when I'm getting ready to, give it to a reviewer, I tend to clean it up a little bit so people can follow what I'm doing. But I found that if I was trying to make it too neat while I was doing my analyses, I wouldn't keep track of it at all. And so I figured keep a gross copy, keep something, and then you can always clean it up to share with other people down the road. If you followed your pre-registration to a T, you can just copy and paste it, but you would want to show the results of your planned tests. So if you said, I'm going to look at any tests about the extent to which there's skew in my sample, then you would report those skew tests, for example, and show those to folks. Also, a sensitivity analysis or robustness check appendix. This is a bit more common, but it can be an appendix to report all additional tests, is if you want to get really extreme with it. But you can report at least theoretically relevant tests is what I would recommend. And multiple tests can result in a problem in which researchers find significant findings that are highly context dependent. And reporting other kinds of analyses, I think, can be really helpful. And Derek mentioned liking the idea of a data management appendix as a teaching tool. As a junior scholar, that level of detail would be super useful to learn methods. Yeah, and so my first assignment in my stats classes is basically to do a data management appendix where they have to clean their data and show me how they cleaned it and what that looks like. But I haven't had them update it throughout the semester, and that's going to be my next thing, is keep that updated throughout the semester, because it's going to change, because you're going to learn more. Hopefully I taught you something, and then you can kind of keep that updated over time.